There is a saying that has echoed through centuries, often spoken with reverence, yet rarely understood in its living depth. What you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Many have heard it as a promise or a warning, imagining a distant heaven responding to human behavior, keeping records, rewarding or restricting from afar. But when this statement is approached through spiritual understanding, it reveals not a future consequence but a present law, quietly operating within consciousness itself. Earth, in this sense, is not soil beneath the feet, but the level of awareness through which life is interpreted. Heaven is not a place beyond the clouds, but the invisible realm of spiritual reality, already whole, already perfect, already complete. The binding spoken of is not imposed by a higher power, it is accepted by the individual. Whatever condition is mentally fastened as truth becomes the experience lived as reality. Heaven does not argue with human belief. It reflects it. When a person binds themselves to fear, that fear is confirmed as experience. When lack is accepted as real, it appears supported by unseen forces. When disease is believed to have authority, it seems sustained beyond the physical. This is not punishment, it is law. Consciousness, once convinced, impresses itself upon experience without resistance. Heaven binds nothing on its own, it agrees. The profound shift occurs when this is understood. One begins to see that struggle is unnecessary, that force is ineffective, and that pleading with the divine changes nothing. The work is inward. To bind is to agree. To loose is to release agreement. The moment a false belief is no longer held as truth, it loses all power to remain. Heaven does not need to be persuaded to undo it, it was never the source. This understanding brings a gentle authority into life, not the authority of control but of alignment. One no longer fights appearances, diagnoses, circumstances, or history. Attention turns to the inner acceptance that allowed them to appear. As truth replaces belief, limitation dissolves without effort. Chains fall away not because they were broken, but because they were never real. When this principle becomes clear, life is no longer something happening to a person. It is something expressed through them. Peace replaces anxiety because nothing external needs to change for freedom to be present. Heaven is no longer distant. It is recognized as the ever-present law responding to consciousness. And earth, once heavy with struggle, becomes the place where spiritual understanding is lived. To understand what it means to bind and to loose is to discover that freedom has always been available. Nothing has ever been held against you except what you unknowingly held within. When that is seen, heaven is no longer a mystery, and earth is no longer a prison one. The idea that binding and loosing are states of consciousness, rather than physical actions or external decrees, is a profound shift in understanding spiritual law. Most people read these words and immediately imagine that binding and loosing involve controlling circumstances, commanding events, or influencing others through words or rituals. Yet, when considered deeply, binding is not an act imposed outwardly but an agreement accepted inwardly. It is a matter of consciousness because the mind is the gateway through which reality is perceived and experienced. What one holds as true, what one accepts as reality, sets the framework within which life unfolds. This principle reveals that external events do not have independent power. They only manifest in alignment with the beliefs and attitudes consciously or unconsciously embraced by an individual. When a person binds something on earth, it is their inner mind agreeing with a certain condition, limitation, or belief. It may be fear, lack, sickness, or conflict. These are bound not by divine judgment or cosmic decree, but by the acceptance of these ideas as real, valid, and unavoidable. Once this acceptance occurs, the invisible laws of life operate to reflect that belief. In contrast, loosing is the release of this agreement. It is the conscious withdrawal from false beliefs, the realization that these conditions have no ultimate reality, and the recognition that they do not define existence. To loose something is to step into understanding, to perceive the truth behind appearances, and to stop lending authority to false assumptions. This approach shifts spiritual practice from outward rituals, incantations, or efforts to control circumstances to inward clarity and alignment. It also emphasizes personal responsibility in a deeply empowering way. No longer is life something imposed by others or dictated by circumstance. It is a mirror reflecting the state of consciousness held within. When one comprehends that binding and loosing are states of consciousness, it becomes clear that heaven does not act as a separate force to punish, reward, or enforce. Instead, heaven mirrors the agreements made in thought and belief. Spiritual mastery, then, is not about trying harder to shape external reality, but about cultivating discernment in consciousness, seeing where untruths are held as true, and releasing them. This understanding transforms life into a process of inner liberation, where freedom is not sought outside and authority is not imposed upon the world, but recognized within the mind that governs perception and experience. 2. The concept that heaven represents the invisible realm of spiritual law, already complete and perfect, is central to understanding the deeper implications of binding and loosing. Many people imagine heaven as a distant place, far removed from daily life, where events are recorded and outcomes decided by some external authority. Yet, in truth, heaven is not a location or a waiting room of judgment. It is the unchanging reality of spiritual law that underlies all existence. It is complete because it is perfect in essence, operating continuously without effort or interruption, unaffected by the appearance of limitation in the physical world. This invisible realm functions according to principles that are constant and absolute. It is not governed by opinion, desire, or personal will, but by the eternal order of consciousness that always reflects truth. Understanding this changes the way one perceives life. When one binds something on earth, whether consciously or unconsciously, it is not a command to heaven but an alignment with what is believed as real in one's mind. Heaven, being complete, does not create new conditions in response to human desires. It reflects the reality already established in consciousness. If fear, lack, or illness is accepted as truth, heaven appears to confirm it because the human mind has agreed to that pattern. Conversely, when truth is recognized, limitations dissolve, not because heaven has been persuaded to act differently, but because the reality of completion has always existed and the agreement that sustained false conditions is released. This recognition brings freedom from struggle, for one sees that heaven is not something to be earned, manipulated, or negotiated with. It is the unalterable foundation of reality that operates consistently. The key is alignment with that law. When one understands that heaven is complete, there is no need to force results, pray for change, or battle circumstances. The invisible law responds naturally when thought and consciousness cease to bind themselves to limitation. Life, then, becomes an expression of what is already perfect, rather than an attempt to achieve what is absent. This perspective transforms both perception and experience. Instead of seeing heaven as distant or conditional, one recognizes it as the underlying truth of every moment, always present, always whole, and always capable of reflecting the freedom, abundance, and wholeness inherent in spiritual reality. To grasp this is to see that all binding and loosing occurs not in the heavens above, but in the mind where perception and belief determine the experience of life, and where the perfection of the invisible realm is mirrored in the world of form. 3. The principle that what is bound on earth is the agreement of thought you accept as true highlights the intimate connection between consciousness and experience. Most people think of binding as something done externally, as if a command or decree can impose reality from the outside. In truth, binding occurs within the mind, and the external world simply reflects that inner state. Every limitation, every fear, every condition that seems fixed in life exists because it has been mentally accepted as true. The human mind is the mechanism through which reality is interpreted, and what is consistently held as fact is projected outward until it appears to be solid, permanent, and unavoidable. To bind something is to give it authority by the very act of agreement. When one believes in scarcity, disease, or failure, that belief impresses itself upon experience, and life mirrors the acceptance of that pattern. It is not that heaven or any external force enforces it. It is that consciousness itself has created a framework in which such conditions can manifest. This understanding transforms the way one approaches life. One begins to see that the root of limitation is not circumstance, other people, or random events, but the acceptance of ideas that have no true power in themselves. The world responds to the mind as naturally as a mirror reflects an image. Once it is realized that binding is an inner agreement, the focus shifts from struggling against appearances to examining the beliefs and assumptions that gave rise to them. The power of binding also reveals the power of loosing. To loose a condition is to withdraw agreement, to stop mentally supporting it, and to recognize that its authority was never absolute. By releasing false beliefs, the outer manifestation of those beliefs loses its hold, not because effort has been applied, but because the agreement that sustained it has been removed. This principle emphasizes the creative responsibility inherent in consciousness. It is liberating because it shows that life is not a series of random events, but a reflection of what is accepted as real. Understanding that what is bound on earth is the agreement of thought one holds allows a person to step into mastery of their inner life. Awareness of this inner law brings clarity, for one sees that change begins in consciousness and that heaven, or the invisible law, is already aligned with truth. The recognition that agreements in thought, not outer circumstances, dictate experience leads to a life in which freedom, peace, and wholeness are not distant goals, but immediate results of conscious alignment with reality. For the idea that fear, limitation, and lack persist only through inner consent emphasizes the central role of consciousness in shaping human experience. Most people imagine that circumstances, external events, or other people are the sources of their struggles and restrictions. Yet, in reality, these conditions have no independent power to define life. They exist only to the extent that they are accepted as true within the mind. Fear is not an external imposition, but a state of thought that the individual permits to dominate perception. Limitation is not inherently present in the world. It is a construct maintained by habitual acceptance of certain beliefs as real. Lack, whether of health, wealth, or opportunity, persists only when it is mentally reinforced and allowed to govern experience. This understanding shifts the focus from trying to change the external world, which often seems resistant, to examining the inner landscape where all experience originates. Every apparent obstacle is supported by unconscious agreement, a subtle consent that gives the condition reality. Without this consent, fear, limitation, and lack cannot endure. They appear only when attention, belief, or energy continues to uphold them. Recognizing this truth brings freedom because it reveals that nothing outside the mind has the authority to hold a person captive. It is only the internal state of agreement that sustains the illusion of restriction. The practical implication is profound transformation begins within. By withdrawing consent, by no longer affirming false limitations as real, the power of these conditions diminishes. Life begins to reflect not the habitual fears or doubts, but the underlying truth of freedom and abundance already present. This perspective also explains why efforts to manipulate or control external circumstances often fail. Attempting to remove fear, limitation, or lack by external means alone addresses only the surface. The deeper cause lies in the inner state of agreement. When the mind recognizes its role in sustaining these conditions, it can release them without struggle. This release is not an act of denial or avoidance, but a conscious acknowledgement that the apparent restrictions never had true power. With inner consent withdrawn, the external world naturally shifts, reflecting the freedom, clarity, and completeness of the inner mind. Life, once perceived as constrained or limited, begins to reveal the unlimited nature of reality, showing that fear, limitation, and lack were never essential but only accepted as real. This understanding empowers individuals to live from a place of alignment, peace, and certainty, where nothing can bind them except the consent they choose to give, and where true liberation is found by seeing that all apparent barriers exist only as long as they are agreed to within consciousness. 5. The understanding that spiritual freedom comes through awareness, not effort or struggle, is a transformative principle that shifts the approach to life from striving to realizing. Many people associate freedom with external conditions. They believe that if circumstances are changed, obstacles removed, or problems solved, then liberation will follow. While external changes may bring temporary relief, true spiritual freedom is not contingent upon them. It arises from an inner awareness, a clear recognition of the eternal truth underlying all appearances. This awareness is the realization that limitation, fear, and conflict exist only in the mind when they are unconsciously accepted as real. When a person awakens to this truth, they understand that striving, forcing, or struggling against circumstances is unnecessary because the external world does not hold the power to bind or liberate. It merely reflects the state of consciousness. Effort alone cannot create freedom, because freedom is not an object to be acquired or a situation to be arranged. It is the natural expression of consciousness aligned with truth. The struggle to achieve freedom often reinforces the sense of limitation because it maintains attention on the very conditions one seeks to overcome. True liberation comes from a shift in perception, from recognizing that the mind has been projecting authority onto false beliefs, and that this projection can simply be withdrawn. Awareness allows one to see that what appeared binding never had ultimate reality, and that the divine or universal order is already complete and responsive. In this state, freedom is not the result of force, but the natural outcome of conscious recognition. The effort ceases, yet transformation occurs effortlessly because the inner alignment with truth dissolves all illusory constraints. Life begins to flow from a place of inner clarity rather than reactive struggle. Challenges are no longer battles to be fought, but opportunities to release agreement with false assumptions and to let the innate perfection of reality express itself. This understanding also removes fear, guilt, and anxiety, which arise from the mistaken belief that freedom must be wrested from circumstance. Instead, one learns to rest in the awareness that freedom is ever present, accessible in each moment, and simply revealed when attention turns inward to recognize it. By realizing that spiritual freedom is born of awareness, not action, the individual experiences a profound shift. Control and effort are replaced by insight, and understanding. Tension is replaced by peace, and life becomes a natural expression of the liberation that has always been inherent in consciousness. This insight allows one to move through the world unbound, responding from a place of inner freedom rather than reacting from limitation. 6. The understanding that awareness of divine order dissolves bondage without force is a principle that profoundly shifts how one approaches life and perceives freedom. Most people assume that change, liberation, or resolution of problems requires effort, struggle, or external intervention. They believe that conditions must be fought against, corrected, or controlled in order to be released. Yet true freedom operates according to a law far subtler and far more powerful than any effort of the will. Divine order is the underlying reality, the immutable truth that governs life, always present and always complete. It is not dependent on human action, approval, or manipulation. The recognition of this order is what brings liberation, because bondage, limitation, and fear are never intrinsic. They exist only as long as consciousness accepts them as real. When awareness is directed toward the divine order inherent in every situation, the illusion of struggle begins to dissolve. One realizes that nothing outside can hold power over the mind unless consent is given. This insight allows the individual to release tension, control, and resistance, and to observe the law at work. Bondage falls away not through conflict or force, but simply through recognition of the truth. There is no need to battle the conditions one wishes to change, because the conditions themselves have no ultimate authority. They are projections of belief. When the mind aligns with the awareness of divine order, these projections lose their force, and life naturally conforms to the higher law that has always been present. This understanding also fosters profound peace, for the mind no longer struggles to achieve results or manipulate outcomes. The individual sees that the unfolding of life is already complete, and that any attempt to force it only obscures the truth. Divine order is inherently corrective, but its corrections operate through consciousness, not coercion. To awaken to this law is to realize that spiritual mastery does not require effort, ritual, or external intervention. It is simply a matter of understanding, perceiving, and withdrawing agreement from false patterns. In practical terms, this means that one can face difficulties, limitations, or apparent obstacles without fear or anxiety, knowing that their reality depends on acceptance, not the immutable power of circumstance. As awareness grows, life begins to reflect freedom naturally, effortlessly, and consistently. The recognition of divine order brings a clarity that makes bondage impossible to sustain. Limitations dissolve as the mind no longer participates in their creation, and the individual experiences liberation not as a distant goal to be achieved, but as a living reality that is present whenever awareness aligns with truth. This principle shows that the true power to free oneself lies not in struggle, effort, or force, but in conscious recognition of the perfect order that governs all things, which operates silently yet effectively, bringing release without resistance. In conclusion, understanding the principle that what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven reveals a profound truth. Life is governed not by external circumstances, effort, or struggle, but by the state of consciousness we hold within. Every limitation, fear, or condition persists only through agreement in the mind, while freedom, peace, and abundance emerge naturally through awareness and alignment with divine order. Heaven, as the invisible realm of spiritual law, reflects the truth already present, and what we accept as real determines the reality we experience. By recognizing that binding and loosing are states of consciousness, that limitation exists only through inner consent, and that true liberation arises from understanding rather than force, we awaken to the authority and responsibility of our own awareness. Life is no longer a battle against circumstances, but a reflection of our inner clarity and alignment with the eternal law. When this truth is realized, bondage dissolves effortlessly, and freedom becomes the natural expression of consciousness. The journey from limitation to liberation is not about striving outwardly, but about seeing inwardly, releasing false beliefs, and embracing the perfect order that has always been present. In this understanding, heaven and earth are no longer distant or separate. They are mirrors of consciousness, revealing that the power to bind or to release has always resided within.